knowledge, piety, and fear of the Lord. May we bless you and glorify you in all we do. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Mother. Land acknowledgement of Liberty.
Before we begin, the Medicine Hat Catholic Board of Education would like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional land of our Blackfoot people who have welcomed here for centuries the Cree, the Métis, other First Nations, and non-Indigenous people. The land is now recognized as the traditional territory of Treaty 7 to the north, west, and south, and Treaty 4 to the east. The Medicine Hat Catholic Board of Education also wishes to thank First Nations people, past and present, for welcoming us here.
Thank you. Okay, approval of the agenda. Errors or omissions or?
I move the adoption of the agenda.
Oh, thank you. All in favor? Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the audited financial statement. Statements. Where'd that go? Audit findings. Delane?
I may interject first, though. We are here to approve the audited financial statements for 22-23. The audit committee met on Thursday, and as a result of that meeting, they are proposing a recommendation. The recommendation reading, be it resolved that the Board of Trustees for the Medicine Hat Catholic Board of Education approve the 22-23 audited financial statements and notes as presented, and the inherent transfers to reserves. The Board of Trustees further approves the unaudited financial statements as presented. So that is the motion that the audit committee presented. In order for the trustees to make a decision, we have your auditors from MNP here today. Delane Sackman and Andrea Gingras will be able to talk about the audit opinion, and any observations that they've noted. After that, Amanda McCree will be able to go through the audited financial statements, give the highlights of what they represent, and trustees will have an opportunity to provide any questions at that point in time. So I would turn it over to Andrea and to Delane to talk about the audits and the audit opinion.
I have a question before, if I can, if I may.
Yeah.
To Greg, are there two motions there? We're asked to approve the audited financial statements and also to approve the unaudited financial schedules. Can we do that in one motion, or does that have to be two motions?
We could do them within one motion because it's one package.
Okay.
Thank you. Great.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I promise not to bore you to tears. Our audit reports we're prepared to issue in final once you guys approve it. We get all the signed stuff, of course. Trusting but want the signed documents. Our audit report itself is unqualified opinion, so what we like to refer to as a clean audit opinion. So we do feel that your statements fairly reflect your financial positions and your full financial operations for the year. When we do that conclusion, that's based on the numbers, but also on all those disclosures. So all 500-ish pages, it seems like, of those statements and the financial statement notes. When we look at those, we also make sure that your accounting policies and all of that is also fair, conservative, and consistent, and we found that that was the case. So it takes a lot of work to get there, but we got there, and our management was very cooperative. They didn't put any limitations on our requests. They always see everything that we wanted. All the adjusting journal entries were provided by management, so we didn't find any errors, we didn't find any fraud, any instances of non-compliance with laws. Great to report. Again, we would be talking to you long before today if that was the case. So no surprises there. The only kind of big difference from the prior years was just that new handbook standard on asset retirement obligations. A lot of work was required to go into that estimate. And we'll let you speak on that. So let her enlighten you on all those wonderful number changes. Very high level overview of the financial statements and audit reporting.
All right, so we'll turn it over to Amanda, who will go through the financial statement. Amanda has put in a significant amount of work into this, as she always does each year, and I'm very grateful for the work and the quality. Thank you.
So my apologies to those who were here on Thursday. The presentation you're about to see is going to be very similar to what you saw last time. But I figure if ever you have to see a presentation on repeat, finance is probably at the top of the list. So here we are. For today, we're going to go through the three statements that I feel are of most value to you that have, I think, the most comprehensive information for you. We'll see what the results of those statements are and how that contributes to our financial health, and then how that sets us up for the 23-24 school year in terms of reserves. So the first statement that we'll look at is our statement of financial position, and that's on page 4 of the financial statements that you have as an attachment. And typically this statement would be referred to as a balance sheet for other for-profit organizations, and it would be split with your assets and liabilities and equity. However, in our case, because we follow PSAS, public standards or public sector accounting standards, we're divided between financial assets and liabilities and non-financial assets and liabilities. Financial just meaning whether or not we can easily change them into cash. And so the first item, as we'd expect, is our cash balance of $5,214,000. And the important thing to note about this statement is that it is just a snapshot in time. So this is the value as of August 31st. On September 1st, these numbers could have changed depending on whether or not we received more of our revenue as a deposit in our bank account, or if we paid more of our bills out of our account on that date. Accounts receivable of $2,489,000 represents amounts that are owed to us. And so a large portion of this balance, $561,000, is from Alberta Education. So we knew our enrollment as of September 30th had gone up from what we estimated within our numbers to Alberta Education of what we were funded for. And so they recalculated our weighted moving average, and we were entitled to more grant revenue. And so we recognize that revenue in 2022-23, but we don't get the physical cash until this school year. And so that's shown as receivable. Also from Alberta Infrastructure, we have $847,000, and this relates to some of those larger projects, specifically the modulars at Notre Dame and Ecole St. John Paul II, where they were either just getting started or the paperwork hadn't been completely wrapped up. And so we're waiting to be reimbursed for expenses we incurred in half of those projects. Also with municipalities, there's $807,000 there. And as you recall, with us being a separate school division, we've opted out of that Alberta School Foundation Fund, meaning that we receive the property tax revenue that's earmarked for us, specifically from the municipalities. But we're required then to deduct that off the funding that we receive from Alberta Education dollar for dollar. So we're no further ahead or behind because of this. It's just requiring us to show it on 2 different lines on our statement of operations. And the balance in there is just a timing difference between what we should receive and when we receive it. The next section is our liabilities, or amounts that we owe to others. And so accounts payable and accrued liabilities accounts for $3,710,000. And so $1.2 million of that is, the typical bills that you would be expecting, where we just didn't have them paid by August 31st, where it's a timing issue of the bill coming in near year end and the check one being the following week or something to that extent. There's also, related to that ASFF fund, $734,000 of funding that we need to send back to Alberta Ed because we did receive it through property taxes. And then $1,188,000 of unearned revenue. And so typically in the spring and over the summer, International Ed and the Academy at Notre Dame start to collect fees relating to the upcoming school year. But because we can't record that as revenue until the school year comes about, it sits on this line item until that point in time. And finally, we have that new line called the asset retirement obligations of $1,027,000. And that represents a future bill that we may have to incur regarding our schools. And so regarding some of our buildings that were built before 1992, a lot of the times the construction material included asbestos. So when we go to dispose of those buildings or modernize, we'll be required to abate or remediate the asbestos that's included in there. And so we had a third-party vendor come in and provide an estimate of what that work would cost, and that's the value you see there of $1,027,000. It's important to note that we may, while we show the liability on our statement, the likelihood of us being the ones to foot the bill is likely not to transpire, as typically when we have capital projects with Alberta Ed Infrastructure included in that funding envelope is an amount related to the abatement of asbestos. You'll also notice later on that there's going to be an increase in our tangible capital assets or our buildings, because the thought essentially being that once we do the work to remove the asbestos, the value of our buildings will increase as well. And the last part of this section is our net financial assets. And this area just allows the user of the financial statement to take a quick peek and see whether or not we're financially viable, whether or not do we have the assets available to pay off our bills, and would there be any cash left over. So with that being a value of $1,095,000, that indicates that yes, we are in a financially viable position. The bottom part of this statement is our non-financial assets, the first item being tangible capital assets, so our buildings, equipment, computers, vehicles, etc. And we can see that we have a decrease there of $411,000. And that really is a summary of 3 or 4 different transaction streams. So the first being that we had asset additions of $1,371,000. So there was that modular that was moved from St. Michael's over to Jose Jean Paul II. We had 2 roofing projects under that were going on at St. Louis. At Mother Teresa, we had the tiered seating in the learning commons area, and we replaced the photocopier fleet as well. Those were just some of the larger items. And to offset that, we had amortization expense of $1,777,000. So if you recall, when we purchase these large assets, we don't record the expense in 1 year, but rather we spread it out over the useful life of that asset. Also, you can't see the jump between the 2 years because we had to record it in the prior year, but the asset retirement obligation of $1,027,000 less the accumulated amortization attached to it of $725,000 is also shown in these numbers too. So, prepaid expenses of $994,000 represents amounts that we've paid before the start of the school year to get ready for it. So in the spring and over the summer, we may start purchasing supplies or paper, paying for our software bills or insurance. And anytime we do that, when it's not in the year for which it relates, it gets coded as a prepaid expense. And finally, spent deferred capital contributions of $38,452,000. So as we discussed earlier about, but there's grants that we receive that are earmarked for specific transactions, whether they be capital or maintenance in nature like IMR and CMR, or if we have to spend them on certain types of expenditures like the mental health in schools grants or the new curriculum grant. So when they are capital in nature, and then we spend them on a building, that line item moves down into spent, and then we slowly start bringing that into revenue. So similar to capital assets, where we slowly bring that expense onto our statements, it's similar with this line item in that the revenue doesn't get recognized all at once. And to help visualize that, I suppose, if we were to receive $1 million capital grant for a building, once we receive the cash, it will sit in unspent deferred contributions until that time in which we either remodel or purchase the building. And then at that point in time, we'd have that $1 million grant revenue moved from unspent to spent deferred contributions, and also see an increase in our tangible capital assets. Then over the useful life of that building, which is typically 40 years, we have a $25,000 expense and revenue showing up on our statement of operations, and so the net impact to our surplus or deficit would be 0. And then by the time we're done that 40-year time span, we would have recognized all of the revenue and the expense related to that asset. last section of this statement relates to our net assets, and we have a value there of $3,564,000. And we're not going to go into great detail right now. We're going to save that for a little bit later. But once we have all those figures, what does that mean in terms of our financial health? And so if we're looking at our working capital per student, this looks at that value of if we took all of our assets and paid all our bills, what would we have left on a per student basis? And so from last year to this year, we can see that it decreased from $764 to $413. And that's really a combination of two different factors. The first being enrollment. We know that our enrollment increased last year. So if all things had stayed equal, we would have had fewer resources, or the resources would have been spread thinner amongst our growing population. But also we have that asset retirement obligation that we're now recognizing on the statements that added to our liabilities. So both of those contributed to a smaller working capital per student number. And the same information, but if we look at it on a ratio basis, this takes out the factor of enrollment and looks at it just strictly in terms of its value. And we can see there that that ARO liability impacted it by going down from 1.30 to 1.17. Typically with this, we would expect a value of 1.0 because then that means that you are able to meet all of your liabilities. But if we were to approach 2.0, then it would suggest that perhaps you're not leveraging your assets in a well enough manner. Capital asset net book value to cost looks at the value of our buildings compared to just how new they are. So when we first modernize or purchase an asset, it would have a value of 100%, and then over its useful life, so say the 40 years, it would slowly decline to zero. So we're able to see where we're at in terms of that amortization schedule. This is also impacted by if we do those larger capital projects like roofing projects and boilers and whatnot, they would have to be added to that as well. This is a similar type graph, but looks at our equipment and vehicles. And so we know that we're looking to replace the vehicles that we have within the maintenance department, as well as we just recently replaced the photocopiers. So we're able to see that trend of the value declining. And then when we purchased the photocopiers in this current year, there was an injection to that ratio, moving it from 13% to 26%. We move to our statement of operations, which is on page 5 of the financial statements package. This is also more commonly known as your income statement. It has our revenues and expenses split out, but also by budget and then current year and prior year actuals. And to keep in mind with our budget for the current year, it was the document that was passed back in May of 2022. And going into that year, we had an accumulated surplus of $1,711,000, and that would be excluding SGF. Typically, we're not able to use SGF for operational purposes, so a lot of the times we have to exclude it from anything that we're referencing. Enrollment was estimated at 2,618.5 FTE, and with that, we were budgeting to have 144 FTE of teachers and 141.4 FTE of support staff. And all things considered, the budget was approved with a deficit of $29,200. But we know the moment we pass the budget that there's always factors that change. So the first one being our enrollment. Like we mentioned earlier, enrollment increased by 22.5 FTE, 2,641. And with that meant that our weighted moving average would be recalculated and that we were entitled to $561,000 more of grant revenue. In addition, as part of the 21-22 school year, we were told that we would be held harmless, but that funding wouldn't be we wouldn't be able to recognize that revenue until 2022-23, which was another $326,000. There were also $960,000 in grants that were announced after year end. So this included the teacher salary settlement, the new curriculum implementation, fuel price contingency, and the supplemental enrollment growth. So with all that being said, our budgeted revenue of $35,252,000 was $1.9 million higher in the actual result at $37,152,000. And the important thing to note is how did that change from Q3? Because there's been updates provided throughout the year in terms of these new grants and whatnot, so that we knew that our revenue was going to increase. But at third quarter, we thought that our revenue would end up at $37,286,000, which is $133,000 more than where we actually ended up at $37,152,000. So what changed? Well, as we've mentioned a few times, there's several grants we received that we have to spend on very specific expenses. And what we noticed is that at third quarter, the expenses that we thought were going to come through didn't materialize. So because we had lower expenses, that meant we also had lower revenue. And so because that is revenue, because the impact on both revenue and expenses is the same, there's no impact to our surplus or deficit. But when we look at that revenue that change that did impact surplus or deficit, it was actually an increase of $166,800. So $10,000 of that was in base instruction. There's $108,000 more in investment income that we received than what we were expecting. At year end, this year, prime was at 7.2% versus last year when it was 4.7%. So we weren't expecting rates to increase as quickly or as high as they had, nor for them to hold for as long as they did. SGF revenue also increased by $136,000. As we're seeing extracurricular activity levels return to their pre-COVID engagement rate, you'll notice like tournament fee, the revenue that we received from tournaments or just extracurriculars in general, or even grad ceremonies is higher than it was in the previous year. And then other sales and services from preschool and international ed, this offset it by a decrease of $28,700, as well as school fees being $67,000 less than expected. The other thing to point out regarding that ASFF fund and how we're opted out, this is where it illustrates that part of our revenue, or bulk of our revenue stream is on that governmental Alberta line, the $28,946,000. But because of us collecting property taxes from the municipalities, the $4,316,000 is separated out on that second line. If we were a public school division, like our neighbors just down the street, all of our grant revenue from Alberta Ed would be reflected on that top line. So this just further illustrates that 85% of our revenue does come from Alberta Ed. So that being the teal figure and the 9% from the property taxes. Finally, turning to expenses, we can see that our instructional expenses are again split out. So our youngest learners in kindergarten and those that are funded through PUF and the severe grant are on the top line, and then grades 1 through 12 are on the second. Budgeted expenses we're at $35,281,000, and we're seeing actual expenditures being 1.3 million greater at $36,612,000. And again, when we compare it to third quarter, we had anticipated having expenses at $37,260,000, but we actually ended up coming in $648,000 less. And again, when we look at why, if we take out those expenses that were related to those very specific grants, it was actually a decrease of $362,000 that was found in small pockets amongst a lot of different departments. But some of the major ones being that within school budgets, there was a decrease in expenditures of $143,500. In technology, there was a cyber project that came in under budget by $94,000. And then within learning services, there were savings of $82,000. And part of that was within benefits. What we had estimated for benefits over the summer didn't fully transpire. And then also there were savings within supplies and new furniture and equipment. Plant operations and maintenance expenses came in $88,000 lower than expected. We had set up a budget line for $40,000 for the design of the theater that didn't transpire. Then there were supplies related to OH&S and Hour Zero that came in $35,000 less than expected. And then with us wanting to replace the vehicles within maintenance last year, that transaction didn't transpire, so the amortization expense attributed to that was savings within the budget of $25,000. This was offset by an increase in utilities of $61,000. Transportation expenses also came in lower. Special needs transportation was $42,000 less than what we had thought. On the Southlands contract, the excess time and distance cost of $40,000, they were saving there. The estimated fuel costs, those actually came in at $28,000 less than we expected. Within the administration program, there was $39,000 worth of savings, and this was found in several different line items, including professional development, travel, contractor services, and public relations. We can also look at our expenditures in a more graphical way, so spending by program, as one would expect. Instructional expenses were 74.6%, plant operations and maintenance came in at 14.7%, so that includes maintenance department, custodians, and OHS. Transportation expenses were 4% and administration at 4.32%. When we look at where we were spending our money, 73% was on human capital, so the orange and the teal, the orange being certificated staff and the teal being support staff, and 21.9% being spent on services, contracts, and supplies. And the net impact of having that increase in revenue of $166,000, as well as the decrease in expenditures of $362,000, attributed to the surplus coming in at $540,000 for the year. We can turn to Schedule 3, which is on page 13 of your package to see in which programs the surplus is resided. So within instruction, the two columns there was a surplus of $1,023,000. And as we've mentioned before, that was due to the held harmless funding that came in to replenish the reserves of $326,000. The school's budgets had a surplus of $88,600. SGF a surplus of $24,000, and international ed a surplus of $345,000. And really, these surpluses were also some of which were budgeted for, but to counteract the deficits that would occur in some of the other budgets. So within operations and maintenance, it had a deficit of $475,000. And so when the budget was prepared, it was anticipated that there would be a deficit of $386,000, and then adding the unsupported amortization expense of $101 is where we got the $474. The transportation deficit was originally budgeted at $244,000, but this was decreased due to those savings that we saw in the special needs, transportation, excess time and distance, and the fuel cost savings. And now turning to Schedule 1, we're able to see how this impacts our net asset. So if we recall back onto that statement of financial position, we had that value of $3,564,000. Schedule 1 on page 9 provides greater detail on that figure. So we can see that it's comprised of about 4 different balances. So the first being our investment in tangible capital assets of $337,000. This represents the value of the assets that we purchased, not through targeted capital grant funds, but other grant funding or other revenue sources that are used to purchase assets. And so that's their net book value. The unrestricted surplus of $1,103,000 is more like our checking account. So the money that we have in our account that we're able to use for future expenditures or day-to-day operations and don't really have it earmarked for specific purposes. Within the internally restricted or the restricted reserves, on the operating side, we have $1,406,000, and that is money that we have earmarked for very specific purposes, typically related to programming. And then the capital reserves are $715,000. So quite often you'll hear us refer to our accumulated surplus or accumulated surplus from operations. And so that's the checking and the savings account combined. So the unrestricted surplus of $1,103,000 and the restricted operating reserve of $1,406,000. And again, we always need to remove SGF out of that because we're not able to use it for operational purposes. So our adjusted surplus from operations is $1,876,000. When we look at where we thought we would have ended up, with our spring budget, we were wanting to use $193,000 of our reserves. We'd have to recognize the ARO in there, which would have decreased it by $755,000. And then on the capital side, we were wanting to use $212,000, but replenish it by $90,000, which would have meant that we'd come into this current school year with $609,000. However, at third quarter, we had provided an update saying that that plan had changed and that the reserve balance was likely to be $1,021,000 at the end of the school year. So if we go back to the statement, we can see that we're actually at $1,876,000, which is higher, and part of that is due to the surplus that we had, so the increase in revenue and decreased expenses. but also because in recent conversations with Alberta Ed, our understanding of how the ARO was to impact our reserves was different than what I had first understood it to be. And so that meant that the $755,000 wouldn't impact it. As you may recall also, we do have to operate within reserve caps now. And so for us, our reserve cap is based on 4.73% of expenditures, which meant that our ceiling is $1,731,000. So presently we're $144,000 above our reserve cap, but we've been in communication with Alberta Ed, and they've advised that we're just to send up a letter to the minister requesting an exemption for the $144,000 as well as a drawdown fund, which we're currently in the process of doing. The second page of the schedule shows how the monies that we've got set aside for other specific purposes. And I apologize for this being so small. I tried to make it larger, but it didn't quite work out. We have money set aside within our school and instruction program of $1,281,000. And so $634,000 of this relates to SGF, $492,000 is the school budgets, $50,000 for learning services, and then from international ed, we've set money aside for the SDSL of $11,000 and religious ed of $42,000. The $78,000 on the capital side in that program relates to the child care modular over at St. Mary's, and just saving for when that roof needs to be replaced. Within operations and maintenance, on the operating side, we have $71,000 set aside for equipment, as well as relating to funds we received through the joint use agreement. And on the capital side, we have $637,000 that's come about from the proceeds from the sale of St. Louis, as well as our intent for future replacement of capital assets. The surplus from system administration has also been set aside in the reserve of $50,000, bringing it up to $54,000. That to the extent of the, financial health indicators. So this first graph just shows the trend between our revenues, expenses, and surplus or deficit. So over the years, you can see how our revenue has come through, and typically that relates to either changes in grant rates or our enrollment. And then our expenses are just a response to that, typically through the hiring or staffing of teachers and support staff. And finally, our accumulated operating surplus as compared to expenditures. So this year highlights that the value for the current year should really be at 4.73%, but we're slightly higher. So that's where that exemption letter is coming. That is it. Are there any questions?
I heard mention of what did you describe it as, a pay down program?
Drawdown.
Thank you. Drawdown program. Are there any restrictions on that? As to, listen, if you're going to draw down that money, you're restricted to spending that money in the following areas, or are you allowed to spend it in any of the, along the top we have administration, ECS, instruction, transportation? Are we allowed to spend it anywhere?
Generally, you can spend it anywhere, but the plan, as you'll recall from the last public meeting, we're 1.3 FTE higher.
Okay.
So that 144,000 will offset that.
So we've already implemented what's going to be our plan.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But we still need that official exemption letter.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Which is on the way, right?
Yes, as soon as we get board approval, I will send that off.
Any other questions or comments? I would just like to thank everybody, Wendy and your financial staff, for all of their work. Thank you very much. Good job.
In the last line of the motion, it says the Board of Trustees further approves the unaudited financial schedules as presented. In this package, which of the schedules are the unaudited?
And you'll find them at the very end.
So like full-time equivalent FTE,
Those are the info only schedules, but it's the schedule 9 on page 40, so schedule of fees.
is it in this package in that?
So it's on page 40, the last 5 or 6 pages of that.
Now, in the past, we were required to list like how much was paid to trustees and so on.
That would be schedule 7, which is going to be earlier, so that's part of the audited schedule. And that's going to be,
Page 17.
thank you. Page 17.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anybody else, comments, questions? Okay, we'll go to the motion then. Who would like to move that? Jacob, thank you. Any questions, comments, discussion? Okay, all in favor? Passed.
Thank you.
All right, we are on to the annual education results report. Dr. Zerton.
So at the last board meeting,
Oh, sorry.
May we offer our friends from Myers Norris Penny the opportunity to email if they want?
No, you don't want to stay? Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
I'll read about this later.
Not the Joey one, the Joey one.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. All right, now we'll go on to number 6, annual education results report.
Thank you, Chair.
So at the last board meeting, our chief deputy superintendent presented on our our results. And as a consequence of those results, we prepared the attached report. And by we, I largely mean Chelsea, who's once again done an excellent job of compiling all of those results, and feedback was provided just as in terms of explanations or commentary on each result. As well, this report required a whole host of extra reporting with respect to our student learning loss and those types of areas which Hugh compiled for us, and that's been included in there. And so, recognizing that the report was shared with you folks earlier and you've had a chance to read it, unless there are any questions, we would like a motion to approve the report as presented so that we can send it off to Alberta Education to be for compliance.
Okay, the motion is that the Board of Trustees for the Medicine Hat Catholic Board of Education approve the 22-23 annual education results report as presented. Can somebody move that? Mr. Mastel, thank you. Questions, comments? Yep, go ahead.
I think a couple of questions. And it's one part of the report. So I think it's an excellent report.
Yes.
Okay. And overall, I think this division is operating at a very high level. But I also appreciate that some of the comments in the report are designed to tackle some of the challenges we may be having. And one of those challenges, I think it's seen across the province after COVID, is in some areas of academic achievement. You know, we have to realize that our students missed quite a bit of face-to-face instructional time with teachers. Anyway, I saw one comment about in high school, concentrating on paraphrasing, concentrating on exam preparation. And my comment with that is, I'd like to hear from administration what exactly that means. My comment is that I hope this doesn't mean that we're going to be kind of teaching to the test, because that is not either, I hope we're not gonna be teaching to the test and or placing an inordinate amount of time and attention on diploma exams per se. Because I don't think that's good for students, I don't think that's good for staff. Research has shown that if you teach to the test, what you may do is increase the number of students who achieve the acceptable level. What happens though is you kind of create a ceiling on excellence, because you're kind of working so much on getting to the acceptable level that this kind of suffers. So I just like to hear from administration what was meant by that comment about exam preparation.
So, overall, what that refers to is that the high school has been looking for ways to find more time to make available for students if they have questions and so on from their staff. So it would just be more accessible as opposed to not having the time. The timetable was rearranged where the Coles time was eliminated. And so now with the introduction, who's going to have to help me out this right now, Curtis Houston, what do we call that?
Collaborative response.
So with the collaborative response model, that requires time for staff to get together. And so the high school in particular has been divided into, I think, 3 teams. And so once a week, one team will be meeting to work on the collaborative response. So during that 40-minute period or whatever the case may be, all the other staff are available for students that have access to get help. And then the next week, a different group is in the collaborative response model, but that means a different group of teachers are available for students.
So then what I'm hearing is that, David, this comment about exam preparation in the 3-year plan is strategy to provide the students more scheduled access time to teachers to help them with any challenges they're having. So like if I'm a Math 30 student and Wednesday afternoons, my teacher might be available for help. If not, there's going to be another Math 30 teacher available. Good.
Well, I think there's also some awareness that many of these students coming into grade 12 this year would have missed their PATs in grade 9.
Right.
So they haven't had that experience of a large government exam before, so there's just an awareness there for our teachers to.
I'm just going to share another piece of research that I came across a number of years ago now, and that was a jurisdiction in the United States. They stopped the practice of having these large, high stakes tests written in gyms and so on. And what they did is they started scheduling the tests in the classrooms that students took the class in. So if I was taking Math 30 with Mrs. Melly, I wrote that test in that classroom because I'm familiar with it and so on. Now I know it increases the need for supervision and so on, but that's just one minor thing. And they found it was successful in raising scores. So that's just one thing that, might be.
Go ahead.
And I've read similar studies to that. The other issue that's going to become very prevalent very soon is AI and the impact of that on exams like that, because while students won't have access to AI during the exam, they have access to it the rest of the year. That's impacting schools, universities, every place around the world that does any amount of assessment, right? That they're grappling on how to sort this out. So I think that's going to impact our PATs and performance to a large extent.
Thank you very much. And I want to end where I started by saying that it's an excellent report. Everybody in the jurisdiction, from trustees to parents to students to ratepayers, should be very happy about what's going on in Medicine Hat Cap. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Anybody else comments or? I too thought it was a very, very good report, and it does really speak well to our district. So,
And I think this started when Mr. Mastel was the chairman. So I don't know if it requires a motion, but Mr. Mastel, I know a few times, but maybe every year, Mr. Mastel, when you were the chair, wrote a letter to staff congratulating them and affirming them on the excellent results. And when I say results, I'm just not talking about academics, all those other areas that we get measured in, safe and caring, high school graduation, should be very proud of all that. Anyway, I encourage that to happen again.
all right, anything else? Okay, so we need somebody to move this. Or did we? We did. Okay, all in favor? And that looks like we are at the end of our meeting. Deacon Robert, can you close in prayer, please?
I will do just a Hail Mary close. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Okay, that's it. We are adjourned. Thank you, Samantha, for coming out.
Yes, thank you.
On short notice.